Mr. Gordon Edwards with the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility. Now, Mr. Edwards, you will have 20 minutes to present, followed by some questions from around the room and an opportunity for some closing remarks at the end. So as soon as you're ready, sir, please begin.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, committee members, for inviting me to speak. My name is Gordon Edwards. I am president and co-founder of the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility. It's a not-for-profit corporation established in 1975. I'm a retired professor of mathematics and science at Vanier College in Montreal, and I've served as a consultant on nuclear issues for governmental and non-governmental bodies for over 45 years, including, for example, the Office of the Auditor General of Canada. I've been accepted as an expert witness by U.S. and Canadian courts and tribunals, and have cross-examined nuclear experts during provincial commissions of inquiry. I'm frequently invited to testify before provincial and federal bodies and to give major addresses in various countries. My curriculum vitae is online. Yesterday I listened carefully to the testimony, the proceedings, and I wish to state on the record that I fully agree with and support the presentations made by Dr. Susan O'Donnell, Mr. J.P. Sapinski, and Professor M.V. Romana. I would like to add some background to some of the points that were made by those presenters. First, I want to talk about the proliferation of nuclear weapons, especially since Rory Sullivan just recently talked about it. The New Brunswick reactors, proposed, the Moltex molten salt reactor and the ARC sodium-cooled reactor, both raise concerns about the proliferation of nuclear weapons to a much greater degree than for those reactors that have already been ordered in other jurisdictions. In fact, you've heard about the NuScale plant that's proposed in the USA and the BWRX-300 proposed in Ontario. Well, they are pretty conventional water-cooled slow reactors with standard fuel assemblies. This lends itself to routine safeguards measures and a sense of familiarity. On the other hand, the proposed New Brunswick reactors both use exotic coolants for which there is no operational experience in Canada, and more importantly, both are fast reactors, that means the neutrons are fast, which are intimately associated with plutonium utilization or plutonium production. The Moltex reactor requires extraction of plutonium, as you know, from used CANDU fuel before it even starts to operate. That operation, called pyroprocessing, is a form of reprocessing. It has been judged by 2 expert panels in the U.S. to be not proliferation resistant, despite claims to the contrary by Moltex. At this point, I have to point out to you that neither Moltex nor even the International Atomic Energy Agency has access to confidential information, classified information about weapons production or weapons materials acquisition. And these expert committees, one of them was manned by representatives of all of the major nuclear advisory committees in the United States of America, many of whom have access to classified information about nuclear weapons. And they have decided that it is not true that this is proliferation resistant. This will make the Moltex design difficult to market because of the unusually heavy safeguards requirements that will be attached to it. In a conventional nuclear plant, counting fuel bundles, for example, is an easy way of seeing that none of it is being misused. But in the Moltex plant, the plutonium fuel is liquid, making it very much harder to verify that no plutonium has gone missing. IAEA has not yet developed a safeguards protocol for safeguarding such liquid fuel. Meanwhile, the ARC reactor is based on the EBR-2 design, as you've heard. EBR, of course, stands for Experimental Breeder Reactor. And a breeder reactor is one that produces an unusually large amount of plutonium that can be recovered by reprocessing. In a meeting with Minister Holland a couple of years ago, I was told that the arc reactor would be operated as a breeder in New Brunswick. Now, I may have been misinformed, or plans may have changed, but any breeder reactor will require much more elaborate international safeguards and more frequent on-site inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency to ensure that diversion of plutonium for weapons use is not occurring. Even if the first arc reactor in New Brunswick is not operated as a breeder, the possibility of an overseas customer modifying it for breeding purposes will always exist. This will require more intrusive safeguards measures at all times and make it more difficult to market the arc reactor to other countries. Secondly, I want to talk about nuclear waste, and I want to say I was very disappointed to hear kind of hocus pocus from the Moltex representative who spoke before me, who was saying contradictory things and nonsensical things about the nuclear waste. Nuclear waste volume, he himself admitted that nuclear waste volume is not a problem because would all fit into a hockey rink, he says. And then he attaches great importance to the fact that they're going to cut this volume down by a certain fraction. Well, volume is not the important thing. It turns out what's important about nuclear waste is the toxicity and the radioactivity, and more especially the heat that's being generated by the most radioactive elements, which are the fission products. So, in fact, reducing the volume of the waste does not significantly in any way reduce the volume of the geological repository necessary. NB Power is already paying annually into a segregated fund administered by the Nuclear Waste Management Organization to finance the permanent disposal of all the used CANDU fuel bundles produced by the Point Lepreau reactor. These bundles are currently stored, as you know, in dry storage casks, each containing 10 tons of used nuclear fuel, which corresponds to 416 used fuel bundles. CANDU fuel bundles are geometrically uniform and will fit into standard transportation packages for moving them off-site, and then into standard burial containers made of stainless steel coated with copper. The entire NWMO disposal fund is expected to accrue to $26 billion or more, and is designed to handle CANDU fuel bundles only. Now, each CANDU fuel bundle is fiercely radioactive, containing hundreds of artificially created radioactive materials called fission products, actinides, and activation products, along with the unfissioned uranium. As an intact fuel bundle, it can be handled by robotic equipment quite easily and moved into and out of prefabricated containers. However, in order to extract plutonium and other actinides for use as a fuel, Moltex plans to disassemble about 2,400 of these highly radioactive fuel bundles. It will leave behind a number of rather difficult waste streams: the intensely radioactive fission products, which I've already mentioned, the large formless mass of radioactively contaminated uranium, which, by the way, cannot be sent for re-enrichment, contrary to what Mr. Rory said. You also have the waste stream of the liquid salt plutonium actinide fuel, which becomes very intractable used fuel at the end. And then we have the radioactive metal cladding that has been stripped off the used CANDU fuel elements. So what was originally a rather simple bundle has now been transformed into several waste streams. Each of these waste streams is more awkward to handle and probably more expensive to transport and prepare for long-term safe storage than the original fuel bundles were. Those fuel bundles can never be reconstituted. So if the Moltex reactor, for example, turns out to be unmarketable, the citizens of New Brunswick will be left with an expensive million-year radioactive headache in a variety of forms that NWMO never planned to deal with. Meanwhile, the liquid Moltex fuel becomes a new kind of corrosive high-level radioactive waste that is probably unsuitable for NWMO's currently planned activities involving packaging, transport, repackaging, and eventual storage. Extra charges will surely have to be assessed to NB Power, and those charges could be quite significant. The ARC fuel, on the other hand, will be rather highly enriched uranium, above 10%, which is already more than double the enrichment of any fuel used in any power reactor today, and about 14 times more enriched than CANDU fuel is. The used ARC fuel will be highly reactive, both chemically and in terms of nuclear fission. Under adverse circumstances, used ARC fuel in contact with water can undergo a spontaneous nuclear chain reaction, something that is impossible with used CANDU fuel. Now, an uncontrolled nuclear chain reaction releases so much energy that it jeopardizes the integrity of the underground containment. Meanwhile, the sodium metal that is bonded to the metallic fuel will have to be removed in order to allow for safe long-term storage. As you know, sodium reacts violently in contact with water, and the underground repository will, in fact, flood. In Idaho, scientists have been working on the sodium-bonded fuel from the EBR-2 reactor, and they've already been trying to clean it up by getting rid of the sodium for almost 20 years, using a form of pyroprocessing to do so, and apparently they're only about half done. I am sure there is a quicker and cheaper way to do it, but once again, it is a noteworthy additional cost and aggravation added to the waste management program for the ARC reactor. None of the witnesses yesterday talked about the cost of decommissioning the ARC and Moltex reactors at the end of their useful lifetimes. This is radioactive demolition. Historically, the cost of totally decommissioning a nuclear reactor must be carried out with extreme care because the structures themselves have become serious radioactive risks. Non-radioactive materials exposed to neutrons are frequently transmuted into radioactive materials, and so they become radioactive waste. For this reason, none of the structural materials in the core area of the reactor can be recycled. This material has to be disposed of as radioactive waste that remains dangerous for thousands of years. And by the way, neither NWMO nor the federal government takes any responsibility for such waste under existing law. It all becomes a problem of the utility and ultimately the government that owns that utility. And this is something which must be taken into account. Thirdly, I'd like to say something about the lack of markets. 3 years ago, on February 27th, 2020, President Rory O'Sullivan of the Moltex and President Norm Sawyer of ARC were in Ottawa, and their message was blunt. As Sawyer put it, quote, "The issue is all about federal funding," unquote. The reason why government funding is so important to them is that they do not have any actual customers. Nobody is beating down the door to buy these nuclear reactors. The prospect for small nuclear reactors in New Brunswick first came to my attention in that same year, 2020, although I realize in hindsight that the seeds were sown some years before. In 2020, it was reported to NB Media that these reactors were not just individual projects, but could mark the beginning of a new era of economic prosperity whereby New Brunswick would become a hub of industrial activity related to the building and export of small modular reactors in Canada and around the world, with thousands of permanent, well-paying jobs. Of course, this requires the existence of a marketable product and a demonstrable demand. In other words, there has to be a sizable market to sustain a mass production operation. Without a market, nothing happens. I call the committee's attention to the fact that this is not a new phenomenon. The nuclear industry in Canada and elsewhere has often promoted a product for which it turns out there's no market. Here's a case in point. In 1975, going way back, Atomic Energy of Canada Limited forecasted demand for hundreds of new CANDU reactors across Canada in just about every single province, culminating by 2000 in a total generating capacity 9 times higher than that already installed in Ontario. At that time in my province, Hydro-Quebec was planning to build up to 50 nuclear reactors along the St. Lawrence River and had already started choosing sites for these new reactors. According to AACL, the only problem with this amazing projection of CANDU reactor growth was the lack of enough skilled people to build all those marvelous machines. Well, in actual fact, not one of those reactors were ever built. See my article on this piece of history called Canada's Nuclear Dilemma, printed as a special edition in the Canadian Journal of Business Administration in 1982. The collapse of this totally fictitious market was followed by a federal report warning that the entire CANDU reactor option may be lost forever unless AECL can sell at least one reactor a year just to keep the enterprise ticking. But in 1978, the Ontario Royal Commission on Electric Power Planning declared that nuclear power, this is a quote, far from offering energy self-sufficiency for the province, at best promises uncertainty, end of quote. From that day to this, no further CANDU reactors have ever been ordered in Canada, although a handful were sold overseas to Korea, Romania, and China. There was no dependable markets for CANDU reactors, and the entire CANDU division of AECL was sold to SNC-Lavalin for a mere $15 million. Here's a second case in point. Around the turn of the century, 2000, a lot of hoopla was generated over a major nuclear renaissance that was about to take place. Well, it never happened. It was a flop. The markets were not there. And in fact, only a handful of plants were ordered, and they both led to bankruptcies and cost overruns on an enormous scale. One of them was in Finland, the Olkiluoto 3 reactor. It was supposed to be built in 4 years. It came in 13 years late, and the cost had escalated from 3.2 billion euros to almost 11 billion euros. That's well over 15 billion Canadian dollars. Similar things happened in South Carolina and Georgia. In South Carolina, they took a $9 billion loss by stopping the building of reactors that were under construction and just writing off the loss. In Georgia, they're continuing, but the cost has escalated from 14 billion to over 28 billion. Yesterday, the minister mentioned the Alberta oil sands as needing to decarbonize its operations. The bitumen extraction process is the largest single emitter of greenhouse gases in Canada, but in my visits to Alberta, I found little enthusiasm to invest in nuclear reactors. It's really a question, somebody has to sell, they have to create a market almost out of a black hole. I'd like to conclude by saying a word or two about due diligence. It seems to me that when millions of dollars of public money and a great deal of political capital is being expended on a private enterprise, our elected officials should take care to exercise due diligence. What will be happening to the radioactive waste from Point Lepreau, which is the property of the utility? Is it a responsible act to disassemble thousands of used fuel bundles for the convenience of an entrepreneurial experiment? Is it responsible to ignore the sage advice of 9 prominent non-proliferation experts from the USA, many of whom were White House advisors under different administrations, both Republican and Democratic, who've written 3 letters to the Prime Minister asking that an independent analysis of the proliferation problem be carried out? What can members of the legislature do to ensure that important questions having a potentially long-term detrimental impact on present and future generations of New Brunswickers are adequately scrutinized? I want to thank you very much for your attention, and I'm available for questions following this. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation, Mr. Edwards. So yes, we'll move forward right into the question period. We're going to begin with the official opposition, and Mr. Lepage will take the floor here with some questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Edwards. Thank you very much for the presentation, and of course, since our time is very limited, I'll go straight to the questions and sort of skip some of the preambles that I could have. My first question is about your organization. Are you affiliated with any New Brunswick nonprofit organizations?
Only in terms of cooperation. We're not affiliated officially with any New Brunswick organization. We do, our organization is basically has a mandate to disseminate information freely to other groups and communities throughout Canada, including journalists and researchers and politicians as well.
So if I get it from your website, there's a list of and access to a lot of studies or documents that are listed, but there's no il n'y a pas de synthèse sur la façon que c'est présenté. Is there a way of having your position on? Is there any other alternatives to SMRs that you've studied or that you have documentation that you can guide us to?
Well, of course, the quickest and fastest way to fight greenhouse gas emissions is undoubtedly renewables and energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is oftentimes underprized because it is the most important of all. The cheapest electricity is the electricity you don't waste, you don't spend. Now, for example, here in New Brunswick, you have a lot of homes that are heated with baseboard heaters. If you converted, and even if the government invested money into this rather than into a small modular reactor, if you paid even out of the public purse, if you paid for heat pumps to replace the baseboard heaters, you would save about 2.5 times the amount of energy that's now being used. We did this calculation in Quebec, and by just converting from direct resistance heating to heat pumps, would save enough electricity to run the entire transportation sector of Quebec, assuming that the transportation sector was all electric vehicles. So if every vehicle was electric and you wanted to run that whole sector, you could do it on the energy savings without building any new electrical production facilities. So we oftentimes overlook the fact that there's enormous amounts of energy to be had just by cutting down on the waste. And then the renewables fit in very, very well, especially after you've achieved a high degree of efficiency. They work all the better.
But looking at the grid right now, have you looked at non-nuclear alternatives for New Brunswick?
Well, only in the sense of what I've just said. The energy efficiency and renewables are the way to... When you're faced with a crisis, you want to do the quickest and cheapest things fast. So you want to get immediate results. You get immediate results not by investing in nuclear reactors, which take far too long and cost far too much. You go for the quickest and cheapest, and those are the renewables. Now, whether they can do the job 100% is debatable, but that's the place you should definitely start. It's sort of, if your house is on fire, the first thing you want to do is put out the fire. You don't want to invest in hire a new architect to design a new house for you.
But I would start with prevention first. That would be my first objective as used to be a fireman.
Well, it would have been nice if we had practiced prevention, but in fact, we wasted time, and decades went by without action on the climate change. That's why we're, in a sense, our house is on fire because of the delays that we've had.
So is your objective to ensure that the nuclear industry is adequately regulated? And if so, would you elaborate on the mandate of your organization on that issue?
Well, the adequate regulation of the industry, unfortunately, is not apparent. We have a regulator that seems to be captured by the industry. And in fact, since its founding, since the CNSC was formed in 2001, it has never once refused to grant a license to a major nuclear facility. It has withheld a few small licenses for holding on to radioactive isotopes, for example, but it's never refused to grant a license. And the most recent relicensing of the Point Lepreau reactor is a case in point. So we don't have a very aggressive regulation in Canada. We don't have regulators who are willing to stand up to the industry and hold their feet to the fire on important issues. That is a problem. And we document this problem by quoting from government sources and from the regulator itself.
And that would be, we can find those documents on your website?
Yes, for example, there's a letter from the CNSC which explains that they have not ever failed to give a license.
Thank you.
Now, the small modular reactors are another form of delay. See, delay means you kick the can down the road. You really don't do anything now. You say, we're going to do something later. And small modular reactors are basically, that's what you're doing. You're kicking the can down the road. You're saying, we're not going to worry about global warming until these reactors come online.
Okay. Well, yeah, well, of course, if we would put only our energies on that option, but I think that we're also looking at different alternatives with the renewables at the same time. That is part of a solution. And if we are not looking at SMRs or some sort of nuclear technology, how can New Brunswick survive with the growing demand of electricity?
Well, I just gave you an example of where you could cut the demand a lot by investing in heat pumps, for example. So it doesn't have to be a growing demand. Canada is one of the most wasteful countries in the world per person in terms of our energy usage. We have generally been energy wasters, and we got to stop that and start cutting back on that. And not in such a way as to make our life worse, but in fact to make our life better. These heat pumps will provide heat in the winter and air conditioning in the summer, and use a tiny fraction of the electricity that's now being used, and a lot of it is just being wasted. With regard to the small modular reactors, I don't think there has been due diligence. Why on earth would New Brunswick want to invest in reactors that depend upon plutonium? Because we've got lots of cheap uranium. We've got some of the best uranium in the world here in Canada, and the prices are rock bottom. You can buy uranium fuel quite easily. Plutonium fuel is much more expensive, and reactors that depend on plutonium fuel are much more problematic. For example, the EBR-2 reactor, which has often been mentioned, it's a liquid sodium-cooled reactor. It has been tried to be scaled up. In the USA, they scaled it up to the Fermi 1 reactor, and it had a partial meltdown. In France, they scaled it up to the Super Phoenix, and it was a complete failure. In Germany, they built the Calcar liquid sodium reactor, and they turned it into an amusement park. So Japan has also failed in its breeder reactor program using liquid sodium. Why would New Brunswick be so, pardon me, but dumb to go for the reactor designs which are most problematic? Now, for example, Ontario is using the BWRX reactor, which is a water-cooled reactor, which is what all of our experience is on. We don't have any experience with liquid sodium reactors or molten salt reactors. So you're going into terra incognita, and to make matters worse, you're just listening to the salesman. You're listening to the people who are selling the product, and you're not seeking true independent advice from other bodies that might be able to contribute a different perspective. Although I have to praise the committee for these hearings, I think in these hearings you have done a good job of assembling a fairly balanced number of witnesses who can give you both the pros and the cons. The difficulty is, however, that sometimes it's hard to separate the flim-flam from reality. For example, saying that you can burn up the waste or that the waste is only 300 years is simply not true. For example, there are fission products in the fuel. I'll just read some of them off. I've got them right here in front of me. Selenium-79 has a half-life of 327,000 years. That doesn't disappear. Technetium-99 has a 210,000-year half-life. Zirconium-93 has a 1.5 million year half-life. Iodine-129 has a 15 million year half-life. So when Rory O'Sullivan says that the fission products are only a problem for 300 years, he's just pulling your leg. I mean, he's not being serious. This is not serious science.
Since time is running out, you gave us also a document about medicine and nuclear power, and your first comment on that page says that modern medicine does not depend on nuclear power. Can you,
Right.
I still have 1 minute left, so can you maybe in a 1 minute time span give us your opinion on that piece of paper that you gave us?
Yeah. Right. There isn't a single radiopharmaceutical that's used in nuclear medicine that has been produced routinely in nuclear power reactors. They've always been produced in very small research reactors, which are dedicated to that purpose, or in cyclotrons or linear accelerators, which produce these isotopes. It's simply untrue that nuclear power has played a major role in the production of medical isotopes. Nuclear science has played a role, yes, but not nuclear power reactors, no.
So, but Can you give us who's producing isotopes in Canada? We know about
Right.
Chalk River,
Well,
but are there any others?
Most of the isotopes in Canada, medical isotopes, were produced by the NRU reactor at Chalk River, which is not an electricity-producing reactor, which is now shut down. And there are some medical isotopes which were produced at the pool-type reactor in Hamilton. That Hamilton reactor, the McMaster reactor, is not an electricity-producing reactor. These are not power reactors. They're not that's not where you get medical isotopes from.
That's all for me. Thank you very much.
Minister Holland, some questions?
Mr. Edwards, I appreciate you taking the time to present with us, albeit virtually. Your presentation focused a lot on a variety of different aspects of the nuclear, but quite frankly, I couldn't get beyond the medicine and nuclear power page. Quite frankly, I was focused on that. I was looking at that. And when I see a line that says modern medicine does not depend on nuclear power, all electricity producing reactors could be shut down permanently with little or no impact on best medical practices. And you talk about Chalk River not being an electricity producing reactor. However, it is a nuclear reactor. I would have a difficult time reading that first line of your proposed paper to a patient depending on chemotherapy. I found that to be very unrespectful of people who depend on nuclear power as it relates to their treatment. I'll go to number 5. I haven't asked a question yet, sir. I haven't asked a question yet.
I'll just repeat what I said
now,
earlier.
let me finish. I've got a question associated with that.
Okay,
number 5, you say all radioactive emissions are harmful to living cells, especially rapidly dividing cells. You talk about that process throughout the course of the first page of that paper, and I get that. And we've all heard that the cure is worse than the disease. We've all experienced folks that have gone through the horrific throes of chemotherapy to come out the other side. And when I hear somebody tell me that the cure is worse than the disease, but they're a cancer survivor, I get quite moved by that. So you're talking about other means with which we can develop non-power generating reactors. You're saying build those, and so what you're telling me though is that you're opposed to medical life-saving practices generating their isotopes from nuclear reactors that are generating electricity?
No, that's not true. What I'm saying is that historically there have been no radiopharmaceuticals routinely produced in any nuclear power reactor around the world. The medical isotopes have not come from nuclear power reactors, period. They have come from other types of reactors, small research reactors,
generating reactors,
usually very old ones. The whole world supply of technetium-99m, for example, came from 5 reactors around the world, and not one of them was an electricity-producing reactor. So they're separate things. And the only reason the nuclear industry is talking about medical isotopes is it's good PR for them. But that's not historically the fact.
Medical isotopes
That's not
save
where the
lives.
medical isotopes have come from.
You know what? It just so happens it might be good PR because if it delivers on the result, it saves lives. So in number 9 and number 10, you talk about creating non-generating reactors to provide isotopes. That's fine. And you're talking about the gravitation away from any form of a SMR for the purpose of generating electricity. But I have to ask you if there are markets being served, and I know that we've had folks that argue whether there are or not, but if there are markets being served with the generation of electricity and or the industrial sector decarbonization use and isotope extraction can be achieved for the purpose of healthcare and profit, if we're moving forward and servicing a market for the generation of electricity or the decarbonization of the industrial sector, what is the issue with the simultaneous extraction of isotopes at that point?
There's no issue. It's simply that the reason they're adding this in here is to make the product more attractive. It's part of their selling campaign.
Sure.
But historically, it is simply not true. Now, it's only in the last few years that any talk has been made, in fact, of producing radiopharmaceuticals in power reactors.
So
and
what you're saying...
That's happening in Ontario as well. They are talking about it now.
So what you're saying
and it
is
can be done, but it has not been done in the past, and it's not where medical isotopes have traditionally come from.
Well, so what you're saying, though, is that the generation of
reactors, which are not electricity-producing ones. And by the way,
one person speaking at a time. We have translation services occurring, so
Oh,
for
sorry.
everybody to be
Sorry.
able to understand what's happening, let's try and keep one person speaking at a time. Thank you.
Next question, and probably my last one, is when you say we need to start now instead of waiting for nuclear, and we need to start with renewables, no question, we agree, and the member opposite talked about projects that we need to be involved with. There are a number of renewable projects that we are involved with right now, but when you talk about that, because you can do renewables now, certainly wind or solar can be employed right now, but without the storage and that being an intermittent source of power, what do you suggest that we need? Because if we're going to do it now, we also need to do the backup with firm power now. So what are you suggesting? Are you suggesting that we use natural gas? Are you suggesting that we use coal to back them up? What options do we have? If we were to turn the switch tomorrow, and we need, for every megawatt of renewable, we need a megawatt of firm to back it up, what are you suggesting with what the available options are now?
well, the fact is that investing in small nuclear reactors gives you nothing. It only gives you plans and paper and studies and delay. It doesn't give you anything benefit right now.
But that's not the question I asked.
If you invest in renewables, at least you get some benefit. At least you get some energy. And we're not saying it's going to be 100%. You've got LaPro to back it up. You've got the whole province to back it up.
No,
you
sir.
Have, you have
The
hydropower from Quebec to back it up.
That's
There's
not
all
correct.
kinds of
That's not
backup
correct
available.
information. So
But
I
you
gotta
don't
stop
know that what people have found is that in going into renewables, what you need to develop is a so-called smart grid, a grid that is able to handle the fluctuations in small amounts and compensate for them quickly. It's sort of like the difference between a laptop computer and the old cabinets of computers that were stuck away in air-conditioned rooms. You know, a smart grid responds quickly.
But you didn't address what I was talking about, because we don't. If we add significant renewables onto the grid, we do not have firm power to back that up, as evidenced by last weekend when we had experienced record low temperatures and we were on the thin edge of a razor blade all weekend long with the full exposure of our power grid. And ironically, during that period of time when we had 90-kilometer-an-hour winds, the windmills didn't work. So there are times when intermittent power doesn't work. So I need you to talk about, if we turn tomorrow, because you can put wind up fast, no question. If that was done tomorrow, what do you back it up with? And not from the existing grid, because we are maxing out the existing grid. Tell me what megawatt, new megawatt of firm power we need to go forward with.
Well, how do you back up it when LaPro is down for several weeks in a row? How do you back that up?
Well, we work with the open market, which is pretty darn expensive, and I certainly hope you're not suggesting that we have that little of a plan and have to be dependent on open market power as a result of backing up intermittent wind.
No, I'm suggesting that you really tackle the renewable energy problem as a problem in itself, and it needs to be a smart grid that responds quickly to those fluctuations. But are you telling me that building renewables would have made the problem worse?
No, but I'm telling you that the smart grid and the components that you're talking about absolutely make sense, absolutely a direction that we need to go in, but you don't snap your fingers and turn those on, and you're given the impression that go immediately to renewables because nuclear or other methods are way in the far distant future. So at the end of the day, it's disingenuous to say an immediate response can be to go with renewables with smart grid technology, that's not there at this point. So there's a ramp up to all of what we're talking about here.
Well, I think that one has to, learn by experience. Certainly those countries that have gone, it is true that Germany is more than 50% renewable now. The figure 45% was quoted by Rory O'Sullivan, but it's actually slightly over 50% now. And the coal burning has gone down significantly by a large percentage. So Germany is doing quite well, and they've gained the experience of how to juggle the variability of the wind. When you start off with renewables, when you only have a little bit, the fluctuations are very problematic. But as you build more and more, those fluctuations tend to even themselves out. and you don't have as much of a problem because where the wind is not blowing in one location, it's blowing in another location. And where the sun is not shining in one location, it's shining in another. So that experience has shown that, that in order to have a more stable use of renewables, you really have to have diversity.
Sure, you're right. And actually, that wind diversity is very problematic here in New Brunswick because of the small geographic distribution of the province.
What about offshore?
We don't have that wind diversity now. An offshore project is one of significance, and that's to be considered as well. But you got to remember that you say that we don't have that level of wind diversity on the land mass of the province. But you got to go back to what you said. So do you consider Germany's recent ramping up of coal to offset the requirements that they've had for energy a step of progress in the right direction?
That's not my understanding. My understanding is that they have not been ramping up the consumption of coal. In fact, their coal consumption has not gone up.
Well, what we understand is that they are.
I will trade figures with you on that. I'll be glad to send you my data, and you can send me yours, and we'll compare notes.
We should compare notes, because if we use Germany as an example, and we see this is a situation where an unintended consequence of the direction away from nuclear meant the increasing of coal, even if for a period of time that's not lengthy, that's a big concern to me, and it's a big concern when it comes to the backing up of the intermittents. That's why I'm talking to everybody about our renewables. Talk to me about firm sources to back it up that are non-emitting. I'm scared that if we make a move in the direction of broad-scale renewables without a solid plan to put non-emitting back up there, we're in trouble. And that's all.
Well,
that's
listen. What about buying heat pumps for people, and you could even charge them and get them to pay back by paying back the difference on their energy bill before and after. You get a payback time in just a couple of years, much faster than you get any payback on nuclear reactors, and you can save a lot of energy that way. You do a calculation, run the numbers, get somebody to do the arithmetic for you.
Are you talking, did you say the fuel pump conversion? Is that what you're talking about?
If you just replace all the baseboard heating with heat pumps, you would save a ton of electricity.
Well, if ifs and buts were candy and nuts, oh, what a Christmas would we have. Do you realize the monumental billion-dollar project that is? We're in the midst of doing that now for a certain income level and down, and it's going to be $1 billion project. Absolutely, you're right. And if money was no object and we could wave a magic wand, for sure. We got 72% of New Brunswick that's heated with baseboard. We want to move away from that, but it has to be done responsibly.
Well, you have to start sometime.
Ms. Minton, I assume you have a few questions. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for joining us virtually today. I want to ask you to speak to us about the nature of plutonium and what your concerns are about this.
I'll tell you, plutonium is a uranium derivative. There is no plutonium found in nature. All the plutonium in the world is created by humans in nuclear reactors, with the exception of little trace amounts that might exist somewhere. But all the plutonium is created by humans, and it starts off with uranium. When uranium atoms are put into a nuclear reactor, there's these small things called neutrons flying around, and some of the uranium atoms are split, and that's where you get the energy from. That's where the heat that boils the water comes from splitting uranium atoms. But other uranium atoms do not split, they turn into plutonium atoms. Now, the trouble with plutonium is that once you've got it, all plutonium is weapons usable. That's not true of uranium. Not all uranium is weapons usable. You cannot make a bomb, for example, from CANDU fuel, but you can make a bomb from any form of plutonium. So that the danger of plutonium is that, number one, it's all weapons usable. You don't know how to denature it so that it can't be made into bombs. Number two, it has a very long half-life, 24,000-year half-life, which means it's going to be around essentially forever. And number three is that it's not so radioactive that you can't carry it across borders. You can actually carry it safely because it doesn't give off penetrating gamma radiation. It gives off a non-penetrating alpha radiation, which is very highly dangerous inside the body, but it's not dangerous outside the body. So these characteristics make plutonium a particularly dangerous material. And the trouble with separating it out from the other fission products is that it becomes much more accessible for anybody to get their hands on it. Now, the Moltex project doesn't do a complete separation, but it does most of the work. The Moltex separation, it doesn't take pure plutonium, it takes some of the other things along with it. But once you've done that amount of work, it's relatively easy to go the last step and separate the plutonium out completely. Whereas it's very difficult to do it from the irradiated fuel, because the irradiated fuel is so radioactive that it would kill any human being in a short time, just by the blast of gamma radiation from it. So that's the problem with plutonium. Now, it's also a fuel. It can be used as a fuel for nuclear reactors. And if we lived in a perfectly peaceful society and there were no nuclear weapons or threat of nuclear weapons, plutonium could be a fine nuclear fuel. And there's a book on the market called Plutonium, How the Nuclear Industry's Dream Fuel Became a Nightmare. Because on the one hand, it holds out this attraction about being a fuel. On the other hand, if the wrong person gets hands on it, it can be used into bombs as well. And these nuclear weapons are not just your conventional bombs, as you know.
Thank you. Could you speak a bit more about the disassembly that you're talking about and what the final products would look like, how that changes the storage? Because one thing that, as we're discussing nuclear, we're talking about really long timelines for some of these things. Like you talked about decommissioning, for example. So I'm wondering, can you talk about some of these impacts, what we would end up with?
Yeah. Well, these fuel bundles, they're about the size of a fireplace log, and they're metallic, and they're, except for the fact that it would kill you to handle it, they look quite handleable. They could easily be handled by robots. So you can get robotic equipment to pick it up, move it around, stick it into a container, and so on. The trouble is that Moltex wants to take those fuel bundles apart, and they lose their shape, they lose their integrity, and you get all the radioactive content spilled out of the container. And now you have to deal with those radioactive materials have not disappeared, they're still there, but now you have to deal with them in a much more difficult fashion. Imagine if you had a jar containing waste, but you drop the jar and it smashes on the floor and the waste go all over the place. Well, that's a much messier situation than dealing with the jar originally. So that's what I'm saying is that they want to take a huge number of fuel bundles, which are these very dangerous, highly radioactive things, and disassemble them. They want to strip off the zirconium, that's the metal coating outside, and they want to pulverize it and turn some of it into a metal and turn some of it into a liquid salt solution and turn another into a huge mass of leftover uranium. So they're not really making the problem easier, they're making it far more difficult.
Okay, thank you. So we have heard that, some of the technologies being proposed around these small nuclear reactors have been tried, but they've run into issues,
problems,
like with the pyroprocessing and other things. Can you speak to some examples maybe, or what the technology that has been tried, like what has happened there?
Well, in the case of the Fermi 1 reactor, that was a scaled-up model of the EBR-2, which everybody talks about, the EBR-2, which was an experimental reactor that was run in Idaho, and it ran for almost 30 years, and it had a pretty good history. But when they try and make it into a commercial plant, as they did at the Fermi 1 reactor just outside of Detroit, there was they have the liquid sodium metal coolant, and there was a little triangular piece of metal that had been welded to the floor of the reactor, and that piece of metal came loose, and nobody even knew it was there, that triangular piece of metal, and it floated up through the liquid sodium coolant, and it lodged between 2 or 3 fuel bundles, not fuel bundles, fuel rods. They have these long fuel rods, and it lodged between them and prevented the coolant from passing through those rods. And so what happens is those rods overheated and started to melt. And that's what, it's a very small meltdown, beginning of a meltdown. Now, the problem with plutonium is that if you really had a meltdown of a plutonium core, then you would have it doesn't just stop. It actually can reignite, and you can get an even uncontrolled nuclear chain reaction happening. And that's why there was a book written called, with a somewhat sensational title for sure, called We Almost Lost Detroit. And it's simply an accurate description of what happened during this accident and what the consequences would have been if they had not intervened quickly, which they did. Now, other reactors have had a sodium metal catching fire, these sodium fires. And the trouble is when you have a sodium fire, first of all, you can't put it out with water because water reacts violently with water. It explodes even. So you have to put out the fire, but then everything is radioactive when you do that. The sodium itself is radioactive because whatever comes in contact with the fuel becomes radioactively contaminated. And there's also something called activation, which means neutrons hitting non-radioactive materials can turn those non-radioactive materials into radioactive. For example, you've heard of tritium, right? That a pro-reactor gives off an awful lot of tritium. What's tritium? It's radioactive hydrogen. Where does it come from? It comes from the water, because the water absorbs a neutron and non-radioactive hydrogen becomes radioactive hydrogen. And so the neutrons actually transform magically almost non-radioactive materials into radioactive ones.
Thank you. And I appreciate you joining us to talk about your, expertise in terms of nuclear issues. We're going to have other presenters here who I think we should ask questions, for example, NB Power, and I know the Conservation Council will be here, to ask about these other options, to ask NB Power what their plan B is, about battery storage. And there's a lot of technology being developed there. We keep talking about and I appreciate you talking about energy efficiency. I agree, it's underrated, but it's very valuable. When it comes to renewable energy, we talk about solar and wind, for example, being intermittent. But from everything I've seen presented and from what I know, nuclear can be quite intermittent as well. I'm wondering if you can speak to that issue?
Well, it's a different kind of intermittency. Nuclear, of course, it's sort of like the little rhyme about the girl with the curl in the center of her forehead. When she was good, she was very, very good, and when she was bad, she was horrid. So nuclear reactors, when they're running fine, they can go 24/7. But then when they have a shutdown, that shutdown can stretch out for months, as you know, with Point Lepreau. We've had long shutdowns. So. And in Japan, for example, they had 58 nuclear reactors before 2011, 58 reactors in operation. 2 years later, all of those reactors were shut down. And that was because of the Fukushima accident. And when things go wrong in nuclear, they tend to lead to a massive shutdown and a massive loss of power for an extended period of time. In fact, those reactors were shut down for years before some of them, and only a few of them, by the way, have been restarted. But there's no way that all those 58 reactors are ever going to run again.
Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, I think I have time for just one more question. Can you speak about the issue of safeguards and the cost, and even you bring up Fukushima, the protections that need to be in place for floods and earthquakes and safety issues. Can you speak to the safeguards that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, I'll tell you what the problem is with nuclear reactors is that even after the reactor shut down, it still continues to generate a lot of heat. And the reason for that is because of the radioactive materials that have been created during the operation of the reactor. So while the reactor is operating, it's splitting uranium atoms or plutonium atoms, and the broken pieces are millions of times more radioactive than the uranium itself. But when you shut off the reactor, those radioactive materials don't go away. They keep disintegrating, and if they don't get cooled, if the cooling doesn't happen, then they can reach the melting point of uranium, and you get a meltdown. And that happens even if the power is completely shut off.
Okay, my time has expired. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you for your questions, Ms. Minton. And Mr. Edwards, thank you for your presentation. It's a very engaging discussion here this morning, so I very much appreciate your time. And if you'd like to just take a moment here for a few closing remarks, the floor is yours.
Well, I'd like to apologize if I seem to be rude, and I don't mean to be rude, and I don't mean to also pretend that I have all the answers. We don't. It's a difficult problem. It's not a simple problem. And what we're talking about is transitioning from one mode of life, you might say, to another mode of life. And it's not a simple thing. But one has to be careful not to be fooled by what seem to be airtight answers that turn out not to be answers. And these small modular reactors, I am very much afraid that these small modular reactors may turn out to be a big disappointment. And therefore, you can't just pin all your hopes on them. You really have to have a plan B, or I would even call it a plan A. Think of the small modular reactors as plan B. So I think we have to sort of make progress rapidly, and we can't afford to wait until Godot, some kind of God comes out of the machine. In a way, we're sort of hoping that we can just take a pill and it'll all be okay. And that pill is called small modular reactors. I'm afraid that the pill may turn out to be a placebo.
Well, thank you again, Mr. Edwards.